Top of the morning to you and welcome to our weekend edition of the special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Olumide Macaulay. The headlines. Belarus President Alexander Lukashenko, who says he's ready to mediate peace talks between Russia and Ukraine, suggests they may start by autumn. Russia blasts Ukraine's part in UN nuclear weapons debate. Plus, UK names new Ukraine ambassador Martin Harris. Thank you for joining us. Belarusian leader Alexander Lukashenko is suggesting that talks aimed at resolving the conflict between Russia and Ukraine could start by autumn. The Belarusian leader, president, said earlier he was ready to mediate Ukraine peace talks if Moscow and Kiev deem it necessary.
There is a little chance that peace talk will take place in September, but a lot tells us that the situation will change by autumn and we'll start talking at the negotiating table. It's possible, maybe not in September, a bit later, but in the autumn. I don't want to give out any specific information, but the Europeans are already talking about it.
Belarusian leader Alexander Lukashenko. Tensions were high at Thursday's UN Security Council meeting to discuss the Iranian nuclear deal due to the participation of Ukraine's representative during the debate. At the beginning of the session, Russia's representative to the UN, Vasily Nebenzia, objected to the presence of Ukraine's ambassador and accused the British presidency of the Council of trying to Ukrainize the session.
Distinguished colleagues, consider this. Today, the proposal is made for you to break this arrangement for the advancement of the parochial agenda of the British presidency, which has a desire to Ukrainize, so to speak, everything, even the most important work of the Council. The invitation for participation in today's meeting, in violation of the long-standing practice, an invitation to Ukraine, which is not a party to the nuclear deal, is a politicized, provocative step geared towards undermining a constructive discussion on 2231 at the Security Council. This is yet another stain on the reputation of London as president of the Security Council.
Meanwhile, representatives from the US and the UK and the head of the EU delegation denounced Russia for allegedly using Iranian unmanned aerial vehicles in its aggression against Ukraine and called on Iran to adhere to international law. Russia denies the accusations. The Council's meeting aimed to discuss the implementation of the 2015 nuclear agreement, which limits Iran's disputed uranium enrichment activity to make it harder for Tehran to develop the means to produce nuclear weapons in return for lifting international sanctions against Tehran.
We are extremely worried about Iran's military support to Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine, including through deliveries of drones. This has not stopped and rather expanded. The EU calls on the government of Iran to stop that military cooperation with a country that is violating every principle of the UN Charter. The EU will continue to respond to this as necessary.
The United States remains gravely concerned with Russia's use of Iranian drones against Ukrainian cities and civilian infrastructure in its unprovoked war against Ukraine. Both Iran and Russia have violated their obligations under UN Security Council Resolution 2231 by participating in these transfers without obtaining advance approval from the UN Security Council. Russia's acquisition of hundreds of Iranian drones and now production of those drones on its own territory, however, dramatically changes the equation. This is a flagrant violation of Resolution 2231. We should not be shy about condemning this destabilizing and dangerous behavior.
There is overwhelming evidence that Iran continues to provide material support to Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine, supplying UAVs with a range of over 300 kilometers.
Since September 2022, the Russian Federation has massively used the Iranian unmanned aerial vehicles of the Shahed 131, Shahed 136, and Mahajah six types in its full-scale war of aggression against Ukraine. As of today, more than 1,000 launches by the Russian Federation of the Iranian UAVs over the territory of Ukraine have been recorded. If Russia insists that the photos with Iranian drones are fake, why do you so resolutely oppose the UN inspection?
We don't recognize the presence of Ukraine in this meeting, and we have no intention of addressing the baseless allegation put forth by the representative of Ukraine or certain member states against my country during this meeting regarding the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. Certain Council members are deliberately attempting to divert international attention away from the root causes of the current situation concerning the implementation of the JCPOA and the ongoing material violation of Resolution 2231 by United States since the illegitimate withdrawal from the agreement in 2018.
The meeting is adjourned.
Away from the UN Security Council, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky calls on NATO leaders to take concrete steps towards Ukrainian membership at a summit next week, and he received support during a visit to Prague from the Czech president who supported Kyiv's bid to join the alliance. Ukraine wants to join as quickly as possible, but NATO members have been divided over how fast that step should be taken. Some member countries are wary of moves they fear could take the alliance closer to an active war with Russia. The Czech Republic, a NATO member, has been a staunch supporter of Ukraine since the invasion in February 2022, supplying military and other help. Earlier, the Ukrainian president landed in the Czech capital of Prague as part of a tour to drum up support for a fast track to NATO membership for Kyiv ahead of next week's summit. Ukraine is seeking a clear signal from NATO at the July 11th to the 12th summit in Vilnius that it can join the military alliance when Russia's war on his country ends. President Zelensky landed in a Czech government plane, escorted by 2 Air Force jets. His arrival follows a visit to Bulgaria for talks on security and the NATO summit. Meanwhile, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg says Sweden's NATO membership is within reach after a meeting in Brussels to overcome Turkish objections. Mr. Stoltenberg announced leaders of Sweden and Turkey will meet in Vilnius on Monday on the eve of the NATO summit in the city later in the week. Countries that want to join the military alliance must be approved by all NATO members. So far, Turkey and Hungary have yet to clear Sweden's bid. He says, in his words, "We are hoping and looking for a positive decision next week," Swedish Foreign Minister Tobias Billström told reporters in Brussels. Meanwhile, at a Ukrainian president's meeting in Bulgaria, the Bulgarian leadership agreed on more active cooperation in the defense sector as President Zelensky invited Sofia to take part in Ukraine's reconstruction. He thanked his hosts in Sofia for their support as Ukraine battles Russian forces who launched their full-scale invasion more than 16 months ago. Ukraine wants to receive an invitation to begin the process of joining NATO at the July 11th to the 12th summit in Vilnius, and Bulgarian Prime Minister Nikolai Denkov signed a declaration on Ukraine's Euro-Atlantic integration. Shortly before President Zelensky and Prime Minister Denkov gave speeches, a memorandum of understanding energy cooperation was signed between the two countries. The United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, has condemned the bombing of a historic building in the western Ukrainian city of Lviv and expressed its sincere condolences to the families of the 5 victims. According to it, the attack, the first to take place in an area protected by the World Heritage Convention since the outbreak of the war on the 24th of February 2022, is a violation of the convention. It added that the Russian strike also violated the 1954 Hague Convention for the protection of cultural property in the event of armed conflict. Russia's foreign ministry has summoned the Finnish ambassador to object to what spokeswoman Maria Zakharova said was Helsinki's anti-Russian political stance. Russia's war in Ukraine has prompted Finland to seek to join the US-led transatlantic NATO defense alliance. Russia also said it was expelling 9 diplomats from Finland, Russia's neighbor and NATO's newest member, in a tit-for-tat measure. Finland had announced it was expelling 9 Russian diplomats last month, accusing them of working on intelligence missions. Now, Russia had also decided to close the Finnish consulate in St. Petersburg, accusing Finland of pursuing a confrontational policy towards Moscow. Russian state TV has launched a fierce attack on Yevgeny Prigozhin, the leader of the aborted armed mercenary mutiny last month, and said an investigation was still being pursued. In the program called 60 Minutes, broadcast on Wednesday in Rossiya 1 television, footage was shown that purportedly been shot during law enforcement raids on St. Petersburg, Prigozhin's office and one of his palaces. The host, lawmaker Yevgeny Popov, called Prigozhin a traitor, and the footage was presented by an invited guest, journalist Eduard Petrov, a proof of Prigozhin's criminal past and his hypocrisy in allowing corruption in the armed forces. The footage showed boxes full of high-denomination rubles in his office and bundles of dollars in a luxurious residence, along with a helicopter allegedly belonging to him, an arms cache, and a collection of wigs, a fully equipped medical treatment room, gold bars, and a collection of souvenir sledgehammers, the tool Prigozhin called a symbol of vengeance to be used against traitors, were also shown. Under the agreement that ended the Prigozhin mutiny, Prigozhin was meant to relocate to neighboring Belarus in exchange. Criminal charges against him were to be dropped. But Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko, who helped broker the deal, said that Prigozhin was currently in his native St. Petersburg, Russia's second city, at Wednesday. Russia has decided to allow the U.S. ambassador to Moscow to visit detained Wall Street Journal reporter Ivan Gershkovich on a reciprocal basis. Ambassador Lynn Tracy was able to visit Mr. Gershkovich this week for only the second time, however, since he was detained in March on espionage charges, which he, his employer, and Washington all deny. Russian embassy staff were given access on the same day to Vladimir Dunayev, a Russian national in pre-trial detention in Ohio on cybercrime charges. The Kremlin said this week there were certain contacts with the United States over Gershkovich's case, but they must be carried out and continued in complete silence. Now, the current UK ambassador to Ukraine, Melinda Simmons, has been replaced in September by Martin Harris, who's previously served as the deputy head of the mission in both Kyiv and Moscow during his diplomatic career. Melinda Simmons, who has helped maintain the UK's close relationship with the administration of Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky in Kyiv, will transfer to another diplomatic post. Let's now speak to senior lecturer, Department of Political Science and Public Administration, Babcock University, Osun State, Dr. Michael Ogu, who's joining us, I believe, from Nottingham in the UK. Good morning and welcome to the program.
Good morning. Thank you, Olumide. Good morning.
If President Vladimir Zelensky was flying commercial, his frequent flyer status must be through the roof right now. This seems to be like a second wave of a whirlwind tour. He's been to Bulgaria, he's been to Prague, Czechoslovakia, and is due to also visit President Erdogan in Turkey. Now, in this Bulgaria visit, and could you begin by giving us your summation of your current state of the war and the efforts of President Zelensky to continue to garner support for his forces?
Yeah, thank you very much. Just like you said, Zelensky has been doing a lot since the war began, to ensure that he has allies, that are going to be continually behind him in prosecuting this war. Because, of course, without the support that he's getting, from NATO's, from the members of NATO, and of course from the West as well, he would have lost this war a long time ago. So he has to keep that momentum going, and that's why I think he's making these many trips that he's making to potential allies. Just trying to ensure that the support is there. And I'm sure that these trips are going to continue, until this war is over. He's going to continue making such trips and continue to wrap up support, for his military and for his country. So that is completely not out of place. I think he's doing all that he needs to do, to ensure that he comes out of this unfortunate incident, victorious, and if not victorious, on a relatively good side.
Let's talk about one of his stops in Bulgaria, in Sofia, where the president, Nikolai Denkov, is very pro-Ukraine, but the prime minister, Nikolai Denkov, is very pro-Ukraine, but the president is not, concerning arming of the Ukrainians. He's against arming Ukrainians. He's not for the war, but he's against arming Ukrainians. But Prime Minister Denkov wants to arm the Ukrainians. So as the war continues, do you think that Bulgaria will find themselves in a dilemma where the Prime Minister wants to support Ukraine with weapons, but the President does not? And in Bulgaria's constitution, the President calls the shots as far as the confirmation of the nomination of service chiefs in their government. So do you think he'll face a problem in getting these countries to continue to supply weapons further down the road?
Yeah. I mean, it's not surprising that there's that controversy, in the Bulgarian government, because of course, interest is one thing that drives leadership, and these are two individuals who have their individual orientations and ideologies, and of course they are open to provide support or support what, so they're open to support whichever line of argument they think is right for them. So that is not surprising in itself. But I don't think that it will escalate to a point where there'll be just like you said, there'll be a dilemma in the Bulgarian government, because I think this is something that the Prime Minister and the President can quietly iron out, and come to a compromise, either not to support Ukraine anymore, or to choose one line of action, or to give them some kind of weapons that might not meet the standard that the Prime Minister is intending to provide. So I think that they can come to that compromise. I'm not foreseeing any situation where it would degenerate to an extent of controversy within the Bulgarian government. But I think that interests are very, very key. And it's not unusual that different people in the same government will have different interests. That is something that is very, very
indeed, that's
common.
not far from what the Prime Minister said. He says he's hoping that the President will be won over at the end of the day. But that brings us to the question of weapons supply and the arming of the Ukrainians. Now, President Alexander Lukashenko was the one that proposed it most recently, possibly not the first, but certainly the most recent, where he says that, look, both parties should come to the negotiating table without preconditions. Now, I know he's not the most popular person in Ukraine, Lukashenko, and now he's also said, as we've reported this morning, that he'll be happy to mediate between both countries. Do you think that the Ukrainians will give him their ear?
I'm not sure that any of the parties are willing to come to the negotiating table without any preconditions. That of course has over and again played itself out to be an effort in futility, because Russia and Ukraine have stated unequivocally that they are not going to come out of this war empty-handed. So to come to the table without any preconditions is something that might not happen. And of course, with this man intending to broker any kind of peace deal, well, I mean, we can only wait to see how that goes. I mean, we cannot be totally pessimistic, even though I mean he's the most or he's one of the ones that we will not expect to succeed in those kind of deals, because of course of those who have tried in the past. The various states that have tried to broker such deals in the past and have not made any headway. But I mean, we can use all the efforts that we can get at this time, to see an end to this conflict. So let's see what happens if these peace talks eventually take place.
He seems to be the last person the Ukrainians will want to be mediating any kind of peace deal. He is the one whose country is hosting the nuclear tactical weapons that Russia has been deploying to Belarus. He's the one that is on the border. He's the one that is closest to Russia, from which attacks can be launched at Ukraine. But it's also, but he based that proposition, that is, that there should be an armistice, a formal stoppage of hostilities to come to the negotiating table based on the casualties that have been recorded on both sides. And to quote him, he said something to the effect that a lot of bad things have happened, but something worse can happen. So he's not, don't shoot the messenger, right?
Yeah.
The message has been delivered. For the sake of those victims who are losing their lives, even though President Zelensky says he doesn't want a frozen war situation, does what President Lukashenko say, what he's saying, does it have merit?
Yeah, of course. I mean, he's speaking facts. I mean, there have been casualties. People have lost their lives, you know. And like he said, bad things can get worse, right? In the whole scheme of this conflict, bad things have been happening, but it can get worse, you know. So he's speaking fact. But like you said, he's the most unpopular person to be making these calls, you know, especially based on his position, where he's coming from, and the role that his state has played in all of this, you know. But like I said, bad people can turn good, you know. So let's just keep our fingers crossed and see, you know, how all this unfolds. I mean, people can have a change of mind, you know, if they see how things are panning out by virtue of the decisions and inactions that they have been making. So let's just see how it turns out. That's all we can do for now.
At the outset of this program, we talked about the UN Security Council session where objection was raised by the Russian ambassador to the UN on the presence of the Ukrainian representative at the UN Security Council, obviously because he doesn't have a right to be there. And he mentioned that they were trying to Ukrainize the situation. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so the Security Council, of course, is one of the places where, you know, states come to flesh out their security, you know, their foreign policies, you know, and of course the situation with Ukraine has been one that has been on the front burner globally now. So it is obvious, and it is likely that in very many of these international fora, you know, the discussions would tilt towards support or non-support for Ukraine. So it's not surprising that even if they call it a Ukrainization of the summit, that's also not completely out of place, because of course Ukraine is on the front burner of the international discussions now, and you know, there's going to be some effort to bring in Ukraine into the discussion somehow, whether physically, directly or indirectly. So I'm not so surprised about that as well.
Dr. Ogu, let's turn our attention to the war itself as it stands at the front lines. Now, we know that the Ukrainian president has said that it's difficult. And he's also been quoted as saying, as it's not going fast, but they are making advances. The Russians, on the other hand, say that the Ukrainians have been effectively not been allowed to continue their counteroffensive, and they've been hampered by the Russian resistance to the counteroffensive. But just yesterday, I believe, the Americans are speaking of sending cluster ammunition to the front lines of the Ukrainian offensive. These cluster ammunition are banned by 100 countries because they are barbaric and they detonate not on impact at times, they detonate after a while. So it's just like landmines 2.0 all over the place. Imagine landmines in a cluster fashion. But the United States, who themselves have people in both Republican and Democratic parties, have said, look, we can't send cluster ammunition. We can't do that, are now considering doing that. So what's your impression of the state of this counteroffensive by the Ukrainians? And is there request or the United States sending cluster ammunitions some sort of desperation on the Ukrainian part to push their counteroffensive through?
Yeah, thank you very much again for that question. Now, it is the truth that both Russia and Ukraine have suffered, significant losses in this exercise. of course, in terms of Russia, with the whole drama with the Wagner Group and all of that, and the insurrection within the Russian state, so there have been some deadly blows that Russia have received also in the course of this invasion. But it is obvious also that Ukraine is struggling. Ukraine is struggling, and that's the truth. And like I said earlier, without the amount of support they're getting, of course they would have lost this battle a long time ago. So both sides are needy, and there's some element of desperation. And of course, like you said about the cluster munitions, U.S., Russia, and there's one other state now that have not signed the treaty.
Ukraine.
Ukraine. Of course, Ukraine have not signed the treaty that stops the use of this cluster ammunition. And of course, that is not far-fetched, even though this treaty has been in force since 2018, I think. And there have been efforts to disarm, or to reduce the stockpile of these ammunitions globally. And just like you said, these ammunitions have some. I mean, they have some humanitarian elements to them. They can detonate, several years, in fact, after they have been, deployed. So there are legitimate concerns. There are legitimate concerns, and of course, it's against humanitarian law, because there's a treaty that illegalizes the use of these weapons. But there's some element of desperation now, especially on the Ukrainian side. And the US, which happens to be the big brother of Ukraine in this whole conflict, doesn't want to continue to see Ukraine suffer. And of course, while they have things that of course can be of potential benefit to Ukraine, and then they're withholding that. And I think that's why they're beginning to shift ground in giving, providing access to for Ukraine to use these weapons in their counteroffensive. But how that is going to play, I'm not so sure, because if that is the case, then of course Russia is also bound to use the same weapons, and of course there's going to be so much more casualties on both sides. Civilians are going to lose their lives, and in fact, the effect of this many years down the line after the war has ended will continue to be seen. So I actually think that there should be caution in how these weapons are going to be deployed, if they're going to be deployed at all. And of course, I doubt, or I hope that they would eventually not be. Perhaps the US to supply other kinds of weapons to Ukraine, or other kinds of support to Ukraine. But these cluster munitions have the potential to cause, more harm long after the war has ended, and that is the concern. That is the concern, which of course is making it very controversial at this moment.
If one follows news of the Ukrainian war around the world, one of the latest headlines grabbing attention is Mr. Prigozhin, Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner Group, who now is in Belarus, or he's not in Belarus. And Lukashenko says, look, he's not in Belarus, he's in St. Petersburg, and maybe he's not there, maybe he's going to Moscow. He's a free man, he can do as he pleases. That seems to be what President Lukashenko is saying. Why is there so much attention as to the location, in your view, of Yevgeny Prigozhin? Because after the banishment, if that's what it is, to Belarus, or the exile to Belarus, it's not clear whether he's been banished and he has to stay in Belarus and cannot travel around the world.
Yeah.
So what's your impression of why there's so much attention as to the location of Mr. Prigozhin?
Yeah, from the very onset of introducing the Wagner Group, I had been very skeptical of this Wagner Group, because of course my concern has been when the war is over, what happens to this group? Because it's not a professional Russian military. It's a private military organization. And so coming to be used by the state to execute a war, there's always been a problem with that. And of course, it is just playing out now, because of course the Wagner Group and the organization have interest, which of course would have prompted them to side with Russia in the first place. They have interest, and once those interests are compromised, the group also will be compromised, which is what we are seeing now with the insurrection into Russia and all of that. And even though Russia seems to be claiming that they have let loose, the head of the Wagner Group. I'm not so certain that Russia would forgive easily that insurrection attempt that was staged, a few days ago. So I think that Russia is still being very, very cautious, with the whereabouts of this man, and to ensure that he's not up to any other mischief, and which is why his whereabouts is being talk of the town, and of course, rightly so. Russia should be concerned, because they are the one who enlisted, this organization to help them prosecute their war. So they should be concerned about what they are up to, because it is very likely that they will not go down without a fight. And of course, if some promises have been made to them, which Russian state is now reneging on, then that would be a sort of concern. In fact, even in the foreseeable future.
Well, some questions. He's obviously not on house arrest, as it were, or country arrest. So, as I mentioned earlier, his plane, his private jet, was seen in Moscow. We still don't know where he is. The Ukrainians and I think the Poles as well have been monitoring the Wagner Group soldiers themselves. And after that dispersal from Moscow, it's not been reported that they have all arrived in Belarus. So it's still sketchy as to the numbers of those Wagner mercenary group soldiers who are remaining in Russia, whether they do what was proposed by the Kremlin to either disband and go home to their families, or stay together and go over to Belarus. It's still not clear on how many of those soldiers have taken up that proposition from the Kremlin. So do you see this also, keeping in mind that maybe what you're saying concerning what the Russians not going to forgive them quickly, with the Russian state television publicizing a bust of Yevgeny Prigozhin's apartment, showing money that he has in his house, showing his tools and what have you, it seems they're about to wash their hands off him, because Russian state television does not do anything but at the behest of the Kremlin. Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, there cannot be a single direction, a linear direction to this issue. Yes, of course, the Kremlin has given orders, the mercenary, the soldiers should be disbanded and whatever. But of course, I mean, that it's not going to be as straightforward as that. It cannot be as straightforward as that, because I mean, of course, when this Wagner Group was being enlisted, the details were not in the public, so we're not sure of what the details of their engagement were. All right, and we're not sure also now. We're not certain as to why this controversy within the Wagner Group and the Russian state, has come up. So of course the direction, the directives cannot be as clear as that, or cannot be as straightforward as that, even though they come from the Kremlin. But of course, there's going to be so much controversy into this. Both the Wagner Group leader and the Wagner Group members, there's going to be a whole lot of controversy, because of course some deals have been broken, which of course I think is why all of this controversy is going on. Some people have reneged on their promises. Certain contracts have been broken. Certain promises have not been kept. And that will be a problem going forward, because of course the Wagner Group has been enabled by the Russian state, and so now pulling back will not be so easy. So even though they have given directives, I mean, it is only left for us to see what eventually plays out with all of this. And like you said, the Wagner Group is not under any kind of arrest. The leader is not under house arrest. It's not. He's a free man, basically, because of course there has been an agreement. All right, but what happens after that is what we're left to see, and of course time will tell us eventually how this will all play out.
Indeed, time will tell. Thank you so much for your perspective and your time this morning, Dr. Michael Ogu, who joined us from out of Nottingham in the UK, Senior Lecturer, Department of Political Science and Administration, Babcock University. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Illuminati. It's always a pleasure.
After the break, Ukraine spy chief says threat of disaster at Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant is decreasing. Please stay with us. Welcome back. Now, Ukraine's military spy chief Kirill Bodanov is of the opinion that the threat of a Russian attack on the vast Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant is receding, but that it could be on the rise as long as the facility remains under occupation by Moscow's forces. Bodanov made the comment in an interview after days of warning by Ukrainian and Russian officials accusing each other of plotting an attack at Europe's largest nuclear plant. President Vladimir Zelensky has been warning of the grave threat at the facility, most recently saying Russian forces had mined the roof of several reactors. Bodanov made clear he believed the threat had only been postponed until later. He compared the Ukrainian counteroffensive operation with Russia's month-long battle to capture the eastern city of Bakhmut in April. Ukraine's 57th Motorized Brigade fired artillery shells near Bakhmut on Wednesday using Soviet-made and Ukrainian-made NATO standard howitzers alike. Now, Russia also reported its forces had struck 3 Ukrainian army groups near Bakhmut. But Kiev claims its forces, despite limited control in the long-contested city, had the Russians all but pinned down. Russia's Wagner mercenary group captured the shattered eastern city of Bakhmut in May after 10 months of fighting. The commander of a Bodana self-propelled howitzer, which fires 155mm NATO standard caliber shells, said since Wagner mercenary fighters had left positions in Bakhmut some time ago, Russia threw in weaker troops. The Russian army in the area has since come under fierce pressure from Ukrainian forces who are threatening to encircle it. The Russian Defense Ministry made no comment in its daily briefing on reports that Russian forces had retreated from a village called Klishchivka, just southwest of Bakhmut. The Kremlin admits the ruble's sharp drop in value and increased volatility, but says Russia's macroeconomic fundamentals remain stable. The ruble tumbled to its weakest level in more than 15 months, past 93 to the dollar on Thursday, pressured by strong demand for foreign currency. This took it losses since an armed mutiny in late June to around 9%. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said similar ruble movements had been seen before and that speculative games could not be ruled out. And this is the part where we bring in our business correspondent, Ini John Mekwa, to shed more light on the business perspective of things. Ini, good morning.
Good morning.
Now, the Kremlin is also saying the same thing that you've been saying in the past few days, the sharp drop of value of the ruble. But they're saying it's not as bad as it looks.
Yeah. Well,
how is it really?
Well, it looks bad now. And but just as you read in that last story, the central bank governor has been saying that. So, I mean, that people seem to think that they are purposely devaluing the ruble, you know, maybe to make their products, their exports more attractive, you know, get more people to buy. Because obviously when currency is devalued, is lower, then it becomes cheaper for people who have, especially things like the dollar, you know, to buy their products. Okay. But they're saying it's not. I think the mutiny has a major role to play with this particular round of devaluation or drop in the ruble, because obviously the little trust that investors had on the ruble is being erased. And people are like, you know, there was a question of, is Putin still really in charge? You know, or, you know, do you have something else going on, or was it just a game and stuff like that? So that also played with the sentiments of investors. And the normal one, which is reaction to the war, you know, a lot of capital flows. We told you how you had a lot of companies that have left and are still living that country. And then we have the tax. Remember, we talked about the tax season, which happened, I think, towards the end of the month. That season is over, so that means that the demand for the ruble has also reduced, you know, and demand places value on whatever, anything at all, any commodity at all. So these are the major reasons why the ruble dropped just yesterday to a 15-month low, even though we see it. And right now, it's been termed the worst performing currency in the world. But it shouldn't come as a surprise. I mean, with all of the sanctions that Russia has been hit with, and secondary sanction threats, customers and investors, they are just looking for, ways that they can put themselves together. And we've been talking about how there's been a lot of artificial buffer to the economy from the government.
Yes, the Russians say their macroeconomic fundamentals remain stable.
Yeah, well, that's what they say. They have a lot of help from the central bank, obviously. They have a lot of funds they have created for small businesses to encourage people to come into businesses. They have a lot of avenues they're using, to employ people who would otherwise have been unemployed, those who were employed by the Western companies that were operating in the country. So all of this, obviously, it's not rocket science. It's 1 + 1 = 2. There's no production, there's no revenue.
Right.
There's no demand, then of course the value will drop. But there's been a lot of ingenious ways that the Russian government has been keeping the economy together. But even if you're holding something up at a point, your arm will start aching, and to start shaking first. And then people will see, oh, okay, something seems to be cracking here. So I think that's what's happening with the ruble at this time. Sometimes their hands shake, and then we see the reality of it. The sanctions, the capital outflows, the drop in exports. I mean, look at them even trying to cut their oil production, so that they can force prices up. So all of those things are strategies they're using, but obviously you still see the cracks in between every once in a while.
Speaking of sanctions and oil, I'm wondering whether you can weigh in on the most recent attempts by Ukraine to make Russia pay for the taking over of Crimea oil and gas energy facilities. And to that end, they, sometime last year, went to the International Court of Justice and got an award of $5 billion that Russia is supposed to pay.
But how will they pay it?
Well, that's why they took them to a district court in Colombia in the United States. And they told them that they're trying to do that process so that they'll be forced to pay. So it's an arbitration, right?
Yeah.
So they can be forced to pay by way of seizure or monetizing of Russian assets outside Russia.
So it goes back to what we've been talking about. The US, the UK.
Yes.
I think a couple of days ago we talked about the attempts by the UK, you
Right.
understand, to find legal ways of seizing or selling off the assets that they have, that Russians have in the UK, because Russia has a huge investment in the United Kingdom. So, I mean, these are just ways they're trying to legalize those attempts. I think the United States is very much on it. They have that act in their house. The lawmakers are trying to legalize it. But you can hardly force a country like that. You understand?
That's why they're using arbitration, and that's the nature. It's better than a court judgment, and you can get those assets outside the
And then it could now be legal.
Yes, and it can now be legal. But
Yeah.
now Russian tourists will be able to pay for stays at some hotels in Turkey with Russian bank cards.
Oh, I
so
see.
Russian tourists
you've been caught
until
up with the bug of Turkey. I'm still in Turkey.
Turkey. Turkey. I want to be politically
You want to be
correct.
politically correct. Okay,
with
great.
Turkey.
I want to be economically correct.
All right.
Yeah, so, I mean, they have a card, they call it Mies cards from Russia, you understand, where you could spend from Russian bank, Spare Bank, and all of that. And, of course, you'll be spending rubles with it. Yeah. And that connects to what we discussed earlier, which is that it helps to add value, you understand, to the ruble. So now they've been able to get to an agreement. It stopped working after the war, with all the SWIFT and all of the disconnection. So they weren't able to use Russian cards outside to pay for tourists, for hotels and all those edibles that they buy outside of Russia. But now they've been able to renew some of those arrangements, and then they can now use it in Turkey. Turkey is a major supporter. Even the grain deal, Turkey was a part of those who brought it up and were able to instigate it as, okay, president. So Turkey is a friend and an enemy because they need Russia, but they're also mediating, interceding, for the world, to try to bring peace and see if they can try to mend some of the broken fences. So apparently it is now working in Turkey, so they can now use some of that. But, there's another company that seems to be in neither here or there, and that's Unilever. They've been operating in Russia for decades. And, a lot of companies have left Russia, but they have not. And they keep defending themselves and they contribute, I think, about 10 or so million pounds to the economy.
They have a lot of historical ties to Russia.
Yeah, but they're supposed to be part of the unfriendly countries. And they say that, it's better for them to contribute what they are contributing to Russia than for them to leave. That if they leave, remember Russia now has an act or a law to take over companies that are from unfriendly countries. So they're saying, oh, well, let's
And they've done that with about 2 companies.
So they're saying if they leave, then they'll be handing over everything to Russia and they'll be even funding the war more. So they prefer to keep on operating there. It sounds funny.
It's incredible. Thank you, Ini. Let's leave some in the tank for you for your program, Business Morning with Ini John Mekwa. Please stay tuned for that. Ukraine plans to abandon conscription and move to a professional army after the war to bring Kyiv closer to NATO standards. And when we return, Russia and Ukraine swap 45 prisoners of war in latest exchange. Please stay with us. Welcome to the final stretch of our special coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine today. Ukraine plans to abandon conscription and move to professional army after the war to bring Kyiv closer to NATO standards. That's according to the Ukrainian Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal, who was speaking after a meeting with top officials where a reform known as the Ukrainian Shield was discussed. Shmyhal added that the government will continue to focus on increasing its domestic weapons production. Finally, Russia and Ukraine have swapped 45 prisoners of war in the latest exchange between the warring countries. The head of Ukraine's presidential staff, Andriy Yermak, said 45 service personnel and 2 civilians had been returned to Ukraine. In a post on Telegram, Mr. Yermak pointed out that some of those freed had fought in Mariupol and the southern cities Azovstal, and others had fought on the front line elsewhere. In a separate post, he wrote that 2 children aged 6 and 10 have been allowed to return to Ukraine following the release of their mother, a military medic, last October. Ukraine's human rights ombudsman, Dmytro Lubinets, added that most of those freed are seriously injured and all will undergo rehabilitation. Lubinets said that 2,576 Ukrainians have been freed in prisoner swaps since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion of its neighbor in February 2022. And that's where we leave it for today's coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. Thanks to our producers and our guests and you, our viewers, for watching. I'm Olumide Macaulay. Have a good weekend.